Um, so I'm going to tell you about a trip I did last spring to a part of the world I'd always wanted to get to, just because I've always found it a fascinating place to read about, which is Central Asia. I went to 3 countries. We'll look at a map next, but this is one of those parts of the world where it's kind of a real mixture of things. So there are some birds there, bird species there, basically that you have to go to some of these countries to see them. You will not see them anywhere else. Then there's birds which you see in Britain that are there and or very widespread. So it's a great intrigue and it's a huge variety of habitat as well. So I'm going to tell you about that list. I was there 3 weeks and on an organized trip, logistics are basically impossible if you try by yourself, I think. 210 species. So it's not a huge list. It's not really a part of the world many of us, at least in Western Europe, are familiar with. So Central Asia has a few different definitions, but this is a relatively common one. It's most of the stands. Stan is I guess it's a really old word for country. So there's 5 that are colored in there. And I went to 3 of them, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Kyrgyzstan. Trip go to all of the others. And in fact, some go to Afghanistan for some particular birds. That is a bit beyond my taste right now to do that, to look for exotic birds, but maybe one day, who knows? One of the things to mention is that this is a really big area, birding in Central Asia, but that's not terribly different to saying I'm birding in the USA, because the east to west difference of Kazakhstan is about 1,800 miles. So that's across, most of the lower 48. I think the lower 48 is about 2,800 miles. So it's a huge area. It is absolutely enormous. So multiple evenings for me to try to tell you something about the history and culture of Central Asia. But maybe one thing to know, and you could say that it hasn't perhaps been, the most prominent region in recent times. That wasn't the case, hasn't been the case throughout most of its history. So Central Asia's got a really history of having strong influences both from the south and the east and the west. Of course, Alexander the Great made it into that region, and it's well known for, of course, the Silk Road. It was always an important conduit for not goods, but also ideas. Advances in mathematics from India to Arabia and then on to Western Europe. And it also has greatly influenced other countries. The founder of the Mughal Empire in India, which is the dynasty that built the Taj Mahal and much of the big monuments, cities like Lahore and Delhi, came from Uzbekistan, Baba. That's where he originated from. So it's had a huge influence. These are pictures from Bukhara, which is a really splendid sort of 16th century, 17th century, lots of buildings from that era. Building on the right's a bit older. It's an old fortress known as the Ark, where at one point there was a madrasa there where Omar Khayyam, well known for the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, who was a mathematician as well as a poet, studied. So it's had a rich and varied history beyond what we most know about it for being the transmission of goods. You guys in the room can hear me, right? So, and interestingly, the bird life reflects this. It has a way, at the center of pathways. So what I've done here is show you the composition of passerines and things that are kind of like passerines, woodpeckers, cuckoos, doves, blah, 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 things like that. And, I'm sure plenty of people have been to Europe. Most of the migrants in Europe go to Africa. There's a tiny number that don't. You go to East Asia, they mostly go to Southeast Asia. Central Asia it's probably unique in the way you have a blend of stuff. So the green is the percentage that's the African migrants, and the orange is ones which end up in the Indian subcontinent. So it's almost even, and it's the only place I've been where you actually have to try to separate species that in the rest of the world you wouldn't have to try and separate, like a couple of types of golden oriole or turtle doves, etc. And alongside that, you've got some really widespread species, whether they live in the dry lands or the woodlands, that many cases are reaching the east of their range in Central Asia, but you get them all the way in Western Europe. And then a smaller number of real specialities, whether it's again in the deserts or the grasslands or the mountains, which are really particular to that region or the broader Himalayan region. So a really fascinating mix of birds. And I'm going to show you a little bit about the habitat of this area. So if we look at the east, there's lots of big mountains. That's the Tian Shan and a few other mountain ranges, mountains of heaven, which obviously mostly go into China. Then, and this is just because I think it's hard to read the legend. So if you look at the top of what's there, the yellowish color, that's the steppe grasslands, which is an enormously broad habitat zone in Eurasia, covers about 5,000 miles, possibly more actually, from Mongolia all the way into Central Europe. And then below that, the paler sort of fawn color is really, it's kind of steppe, but it's very dry, semi-desert. Again, that's a habitat that goes into Western China and goes across all the way. In fact, you know, you get that habitat in parts of Spain as well, and some of the same species. And as well as sort of pockets of woodlands, etc. But the main thing is it's the mountains and the different types of steppe. And I borrowed that nice map actually from the Bird Guide to Central Asia, which is it's a nice little book. So this is our eBird track, and you can see it's clustered into a few areas, and you can see most of the region we didn't go to. In fact, as far as I'm aware, pretty much nobody birds in most of the region. Very few local birders. I think there's some, you know, scientists, etc., based in Almaty in southern Kazakhstan, but really very few local birders. It's not one of those countries where you have many. Yeah, Emily had mentioned in the introduction, I spent some time in India. This was in the 90s. Plenty of birders there, even though it was a, you know, much poorer country then than it is now. I was in Oman in November, no local birders. You know, the only birders there are expats. So whatever, birding hasn't caught on everywhere. And actually, most of that region is really underpopulated. I think the only birding that goes on are occasional surveys by people like BirdLife International and other conservation organizations trying to get a handle on the population of some of the rarer or declining species. But we were really focused, and I'll zoom in on this and some of the stuff in a bit, on the area around Bukhara, which is on the left-hand side, and then the mountains and the dry steppes near the Kazakh-Kyrgyz border, and then up near Astana, which is the present-day capital of Kazakhstan, was called Nur Sultan until for a while, but not anymore. And I'll go through all of this. So I'm going to take you through something which, in a way that wasn't the way we did it, but it's kind of a bit more logical, I think. And we're going to start in the mountains in the east. So this is basically in Kyrgyzstan. It's the Tian Shan Mountains, the snow-capped mountains. The tallest mountain there in Kyrgyzstan is, I can't remember what it's called, but it's about 24,500 feet, which is not that big for that part of the world, but it's 2,000 feet higher than the tallest mountain in the rest of the world. So this is all part of the Himalayan cryosphere, as you call it. That lake, actually it's not particularly birdy, but it's interesting for a couple of reasons. It's a saline lake. Apparently it's the 8th deepest in the world, Issyk Kul it's called. And also a couple of years ago, some scientists looking at some archaeological sites thought they had pinpointed this area as the jumping off point for the Black Death that occurred in Europe and Western Eurasia and Central Eurasia in the 14th century, because they found some of the earliest traces of the variety of the plague that caused it just to the west of Issyk Kul. The other thing that's contributed, perhaps more constructively, is a lot of, at least it's claimed, what I read, a lot of fruits that we eat have come from this part of the world. So the apple apparently originated in, I think, the Kazakh part of this, but as well as pomegranates, pears, and a few other fruits. So it's contributed an awful lot. We basically spent our time going up valleys, looking for birds, and it is a spectacular part of the world. In fact, hiking groups go there. This is the Karakol Valley. Hiking, the people, we did see some, not many tourists, we didn't see many, but there were a couple of hiking groups. A little bit more stylishly dressed and had better gear than the birders, but that shouldn't surprise us. Um, but pretty typical vista in this part of the world. In the valley, there's grass, and I'll show you why it's like that in a moment. And then forested slopes up there, and of course, the steep slopes rising up to well over 20,000 feet. I don't have a picture of it, but as you go through the valley and look up at the cliffs, you have Himalayan snowcocks calling. It's a very large game bird. That's the bird that's been introduced into the US, and some sort of CGI version of it features in the big year, I think. I don't think it's a real bird. But of course, one of the reasons for visiting this, one of the things to look for in these broad, gravelly rivers is this bird. We didn't get terribly close to it, the ibis bill. It's a type of shorebird in its own family. And it's basically restricted to rivers in the Himalayas and neighboring mountain ranges, and moves a bit out of these ranges in very cold weather in winter. You'd think looking at it that that'd be easy to find. But it took 7 or 8 birders, most of us with scopes, took us 2 hours to find that. It's one of these things where, it stands on the edge of the river and it's almost impossible to tell from a rock. This was one of the birds I'd really wanted to see. I'd missed it in India. I mean, you do get them in northern India in winter, and it was a delight. It's one of these birds that people who go around listing bird families want to see, because it's the only bird in its family at the moment, because they're always revising taxonomy. So I showed you a picture earlier of the valley, and it looked like a really nice, there. But that's really because there's an awful lot of livestock going around. And Kyrgyzstan, we kept on seeing these groups. I mean, it's very interesting to see them. 3 or 4 guys on horseback. So really, to see some of this stuff, you have to get up onto the steeper slopes or a bit higher up, because everything has been eaten up by the herds of horses and cattle, etc. So to see some of these things, we had to go a bit higher up. So these are species of bird which are fairly restricted in their range. On the left is a fire-fronted serin. It's a type of finch. I think it gets as far west as eastern Turkey in the mountains there. At the bottom, a white-winged grosbeak. And at the top, one of the ruby throats. This is a Himalayan ruby throat. I'm sure everyone's heard of this 3 ruby throat species. So that's a lovely songster. These are birds which are pretty, fairly range restricted. And you really had to make your way up the valley to get to habitat that was kind of okay. It's not really protected. It could be that, I think we might have been in a national park, but I don't think it counted for much in terms of protection. So a bit further up the mountain, there I am, trying not to look too cold. This is at about 12,500 feet. This is the end of May, start of June. 12,500 feet in this part of the world is, that's in the valley. You're way down in the valley. But even then, it was cold. This is a road that is actually open year round, because I've quite a lot higher up the valley is a gold mine. And so every 20 minutes or so, a really odd looking, probably Soviet era transport would go past, which had some sort of track thing at the back, which were, I guess, workers going to and from the gold mine. It looks really bleak, and it's hard to understand how some birds can live up there, but they do. And, birds, you think, well, how does a bird like this, Goldenstaats or white-winged redstart, it's about the size of a bluebird and probably tries to eat insects, at least in the summer. One was on territory in this abandoned shed, and a bit further along, all these scree slopes, which just were boulders and seemed to have absolutely no vegetation. But there was so far off, I don't have a picture of it, but a bird called a brown accenter, which looks quite a lot like a dunnock, for those of you who've been to Western Europe. What used to be called a hedge sparrow. It's a type of accenter. You look at it and think, how are these birds surviving up here? Of course, they're very low density. It's not like there's lots of them, but they're doing okay. And this is again a bird that you get as far, you get it in places like Azerbaijan. You can get it a bit into Western China, but very much a mountain speciality of this region, and one of the largest red starts. It's a big group of birds in mostly in Asia, actually. Of course, this is also the home of the lammergeier, the bearded vulture, which has got a pretty wide range. But this is by far the place I've seen the most. I must have seen about half a dozen of them, including this pair that just don't know whether it's some sort of well, it's not really a display flight, but I don't know whether it was some sort of bonding flight. They flew quite low over us, close together, soaring very slowly for a while. This is a bird that, it's a bit of a specialist feeder on bones, cracking bones open by dropping them, etc. That's one of the things it does. And you get this as far west as Western Europe, but it's a big Gaia. I have a feeling it's actually more related to the old world kites than vultures, but I'm not entirely sure. So this is part of the journey back down from the mountains. So as you head down from Kyrgyzstan back to the border with Kazakhstan, there's some big mountains on the border. I can't actually remember what direction we're looking at there, but the mountain ranges are close enough that the valleys in between are actually pretty plenty of water. Lots of extensive agriculture, so people grow some crops, but it's not. And we spent a while birding. It was just an experience. Not many of the birds were new to me, but just the sheer density of birds in this farmland. It's, it made me think it must have been like England was 100 years ago, with, greater white throats, which is a type of songbird that migrates to Africa, singing from pretty much every bush. There were birds, citrine wagtails, which migrate to India, a type of little brown job called the Pallas's grasshopper, which migrates to East Asia, all sharing the same habitat and density. It was a wonderful experience. One of the birds that was there is this one, the corncrake. So the corncrake is a bird that you get as far west as Western Scotland, hugely declined in Western Europe because agriculture is much too intensive now for it. It's a type of rail, it's a type of crake. In fact, all crakes get their name from this bird, from its call, which you'll hear in a second. So this doesn't live around water, this lives in grasslands, etc. And, it's quite secretive. We got a glimpse of this bird, and you'll hear if you could play the call, please, Luke, could you tap on it? It's a really intriguing call. That's not too loud, is it? It was louder than that in real life. Yeah, we may need to, I don't know whether we can turn up the volume on the sounds on the laptop. Okay, all right. So, and its Latin name, Crex crex, which is where the word crake, which is applied to all of these crakes. That's where it comes from. But it was great to see that bird, a bird I've always wanted to see. So I'm going to jump not to where we went next in terms of sequence, but kind of we're segueing in terms of habitat here. So I'm going to take you up to the northern part of Kazakhstan, which is the steppes, the grasslands there. And this is, you can kind of just see at the top where we were based in Astana, which is under the talking MBC, a little label. That's the capital now, and it's a really modern city. It reminded me of some of these cities in China where you go and it was all at the same time 5 years ago. It's lots of modern buildings, and quite close to there, as soon as you drive outside of the city limits, you start getting into the steppes, the grasslands, and it's quite a wet area as well, as you can see on this map. Lots of lakes. Lots of stuff like that. So one of the things you get in lands is a couple of really fabulous, we get some great turns and goals. On the left is wing tern. They also have Eurasian black tern. On the right is probably my favorite gull, the Pallas's gull or the great black-headed gull. That's bigger than, it's a bird that's bigger than herring gull. As you can see, it's mostly got white on the edge of the wings, apart from a black. And it's got this big black hood and yellow. So a wonderful bird. And they were breeding in mixed colonies with the gulls, with some lesser blackback gulls. So sprinkled throughout the grasslands is lakes with lots of water birds. Also, there is this bird, which is, you probably think, well, I've seen a bird that looks a bit like, fairly closely related to the ruddy duck. The version of that is called the white-headed duck. And this has a wide but really fragmented distribution. And this is classed probably as near threatened or maybe in BirdLife International because its distribution is so patchy now. Get it a few, and then it's basically not now in a lot of places where it used to be 10, 20 years ago. And one of the places you can see it is this part of Kazakhstan on some of the lakes. This was actually a bird we saw actually in Astana itself by all these high rises. They've actually had, this is one of the reasons as well, where they try to control ruddy ducks, which were introduced into the UK and have spread to parts of Western Europe. They actually hybridize with white-headed ducks, so they're diluting the gene. So this is the this. I'm just giving you habitat shots. So this is what this just an endless sea of grass. You do have a clip of sound of lark song. Okay, very good idea. Thank you. So I recorded that. I recorded these recordings I made while I was there. So what you're going to hear this time is several species of lark. But this open country, if you go to anywhere in Eurasia and you have this open country, you have quite a few species of lark. So we'll see if we can hear this clip. So you just kind of go strolling around the steppes. These and larks. For those of you been to Western Europe and seen this, what the skylark does, the Eurasian skylark, which gets up in the sky and flies around. Quite a few species do that as well. But in this part of the world, what people really want to see are two very range-restricted larks. There's the, on the left, you won't be surprised if I tell you that's called the black lark. Males are all black, at least in summer plumage. The females are kind of, plumage reminds me of a red-winged blackbird, female red-winged blackbird, actually. And it's a big lark, very charismatic. And on the right is a white-winged lark. And both of those species, they occupy a range across China. There's a really intriguing story about the black lark, which I believe is true. At least I've read it several times in different places to be true. About somebody in England who tried to fake a sighting of a black lark. They did a model, like a little figurine of it, and put it in a field and took a picture. That's the story I've heard, and tried to say it was a first for Britain. But I think the issue was that he had several pictures and the bird was in exactly the same pose in the different pictures. So anyway, that's a story I heard. But if you go to Kazakhstan, you see these birds for real. It's just a wonderful experience having these birds flying around, singing away at this time of year. This was early June with other very common birds. So you also get Eurasian skylark there, which is found throughout Europe. So it's a mixture of stuff that's very localized and stuff that's very widespread. So another bird which is in a lot of trouble in this summers in this part of the world is a sociable lapwing. This is my picture, but it's actually from India. Did not see one on this trip. It's listed as critically endangered. It is related to the lapwing, and it likes this not long grass, but lower grass. And one of the reasons that they think it's been in a lot of trouble is hunting on the migration and wintering grounds. So you can see them in winter in parts of Arabia, see, in Oman, for example. And I think there's a lot of hunting pressure on this species there. So sadly, it's declined a lot. It's kind of difficult with, in general, and you'll hear about this with one or two other species, because there's so few people birding there, there aren't any local birders and the birding tour groups, they pretty much all have to go there at the same time and they're covering a lot of ground. So if they get somewhere and the sociable lapwing isn't where it was last year, it's really hard to find because you saw the map. I mean, it's an enormous landscape. And unfortunately, these birds, some of these birds anyway, are at population levels where it's kind of hard to find them. This bird sometimes makes its way to India in winter. And so this was in northwest India, actually a long time ago. I took this picture over 20 years ago. Would have been nice to reconnect it on this trip, but we didn't. But it is a real goal of the birding tour companies when they go to Central Asia to see this. So this is a blue throat singing away, a red-spotted blue throat, and also breeding in that same area. There's plenty of little brown jobs in this part of the world, which if you're into them is great. So these are some of the old walled warblers. On the left, there's a booted warbler, which is a real tiger specialist. In the forests, it gets as far east in the far west in the forests as eastern Finland. And Bligh's reed warbler as well, which is the bird on the right. Bligh's reed warbler has a wonderful song. There's a lot more birds that mimic Eurasia than there are here. The blue throat's a mimic, which you just puts lots of mimicry in its song. Bligh's reed warbler strings together, and it's a very nice songster, just lots of different to it, saying, oh, that's that type of bird, that's that. And these two birds, the reed warbler is now breeding in parts of Western Europe where you would never expected to see it 20 years ago. But a little taste of Siberia at the river edges where it's a bit damper. So what we've been doing is going from most moist, now we're going to go to the drier grasslands. And this is a habitat a lot like, the intermontane west, for example. So a lot of this area, once you get away from the mountains, is sagebrush, Artemisia type vegetation, dry, very dry grasslands, but not desert. It's not quite as dry as that. And so we covered quite a few different areas. Some of the stuff in the east, which is a bit rockier. And then some of the stuff north and west of Almaty is really where this dry steppes or semi-desert starts. So not many places to stay. So one of the things that you can do, which is actually an awful lot of fun, is to stay in these yurt camps. This is one out northwest of Almaty, out in the steppes. And I'm pretty sure that one there, the second from the right, was my personal tent. This is the dining tent. Very good food, actually. But the best thing about this again is that you're right in the habitat. And here you have larks and wheatears. Perhaps we'll have another go. This is the last sound clip. Can we have a go at that? Luke, please. Thank you. Sure. Again, it's a recording of larks. Thank you. So that's what greets, you hear that actually, and the larks are singing. You have that for the first couple of hours. And you could just, get out your yurt and start wandering around and see these things right at your feet. Some, again, are very widespread birds, like on the left is a greater short-toed lark. And on the top right, a very big Palandra, mostly what you were hearing on that clip. Sounds a lot like a skylark actually when it's singing. And below that is the Turkestan short-toed lark. These are all kind of quite plain birds. It's a bit like trying to tell some of the sparrows apart. Actually do look quite different once learn some of the bill shapes and body shapes, etc. But you go out, wander around, and there's literally dozens of these birds within a few hundred yards. Lots of wheatears as well, particularly Isabelline wheatear. Seem to be one every 100 yards. You also get sand grouse there. So sand grouse are found in dry country in Africa, Southwest Europe, Spain, and maybe Southwest France, and the steppes all the way through to Western China. This is a Pallas's sand grouse, and it's a female. I don't know whether everyone knows, but sand grouse, well, they're related to pigeons, but they really behave quite differently. They live in they fly to water once a day, and that's usually where maybe twice a day. That's usually when you see them. Is because otherwise they're just sitting on the ground eating stuff, and they're kind of the same color as the soil. And they fly around calling. There's lots of hunting pressure on sand grouse, unfortunately. And the males, I think it's just the males, will, when they get to water and during the breeding season, when they have chicks, they immerse their breast because they have these feathers which will collect, and they fly, could be miles back to the chicks, and they give them water that. So quite remarkable birds that way. The Pallas's sand grouse also is kind of got a bit of a weird history. It used to be found in bigger numbers further west. I guess just changes in agriculture mean you don't get them anymore. And in the night, have these eruptions, a bit like we used to that with finches here, right? Winter finches. This would do the same into Western Europe. And this sand grouse even bred Britain in the 19th century in a few years, which is kind of remarkable. Hasn't been one that far west in, I don't know, probably about 100 years, I'm sure. But we saw maybe 2 or 3 types of sand grouse, but it's nice to get a really good view of this one. This was coming into water quite close to where we were. Another plover, so we saw the sociable lapwing. This is I guess a Caspian plover because close to the Caspian Sea, which you'll have seen on the map. It's related to things like the semi-palmated plover. It's fairly, sand plovers, etc. It's very much a dry grassland plover, and it breeds about far east as that area you saw us in on the map, where it's a bit more colorful. Man on its probably passage, maybe wintering. This is a pretty hard bird to connect with, actually. Grounds are mostly inaccessible. I think the places where a lot of the companies go, which is the yurt camp where I was, is right at the eastern edge of the breeding range. So probably there's more further west. This was, love shorebirds. This was really high up on my wanting to see list, and and I finally got to see it. One of the other, there's a few people who are specialists of steppe and here, and one of these is the rosy starling. So this is related very closely to the Eurasian starling. These birds, they winter in India, often in like shrubland and not really in grassland. And then when they get up to the steppes, they roam trying to find where the locusts are that year, because that's what they're going to feed the chicks. So a bit nomadic. When they think they found a good area, they nest, and they nest in huge numbers. We saw this bird and several thousand of its friends nesting in walls of an old cemetery, and it was like to an Alcid breeding colony. It was just so flying around. It was literally like a seabird colony. And of course, they'll range out to a big area around the steppes to try and collect food for their youngsters. And at this time of the year, they're this wonderful color. The bills are really bright pink, and they've got a bit of a crazy hairdo. And the other bird, which is quite common there, is the lesser kestrel. So, and this is, at least during this time of the year, it's very much like a grasshopper locust specialist. That's really what it feeds on. So like the rosy starling, that tends to congregate, and it can be colonial, a colonial nesting bird in those areas. It looks quite a lot like a more colorful version of the kestrel. So you can see its resemblance to the American kestrel. It's a little bit larger than that, and that's a male. And that was nesting. There were several pairs cemetery where we saw the rosy starlings. I was showing you a little bit on the east, so sort of more mountainous areas. So there's some interesting bunting there. And there's the red-headed bunting on the left, sitting, I think, what is a sax bush, and the gray neck bunting on the right, which both of those will, and the bird on the right, in spite 4 years in India, I completely failed to see it there, but I did connect with it in this one. Really, cheerful little birds, lovely songs. And again, it's one of those birds where you pretty much go to this part of the world to try to find them, at least on their breeding grounds. The bird on the right, for anyone who's ever seen an ortolan bunting in Western Europe, it's a lot like that. Looks very similar to an ortolan bunting, and the song is actually quite similar. So where you get closer to some of the that go through the area, open woodlands where there's lots of poplar and willow. It's a bit like the Southwest. If you go in the Southwest along the arroyos and seasonal rivers, you find, or even rivers, you find cottonwoods. Except this is on a bit of a bigger scale because just there's from enormous mountains, and even though it doesn't rain very much here, there's a lot of groundwater. And there's some very localized birds here. One of which I did see, but I didn't get a great picture, so you won't see it, but it's a yellow-eyed pigeon. It actually looks quite a bit like your feral pigeon, except it's the wild pigeon color, but it's that size. But breeds only in these extensive woodlands and these along the river system and the big groundwater aquifers in this part of the world. And this woodpecker, the white-winged woodpecker, one of the types of black and white woodpeckers you get in Eurasia. So it looks quite a lot like a greater spotted woodpecker, but this is very much restricted to these softwoods, these poplar and willow woodlands along the rivers in Central Asia. And also there, as well as some stuff that's super specialized, you've got stuff that's found everywhere. This is a common nightingale, cells as well as this. But this is an African migrant that spend the summers here, but will sit in these woodlands. And we did spend some time at a camp in the woodlands, and you're trying to sleep, and they're singing away, and this is kind of near the east end of its range, and some other birds, which again are right up against the east end of the range in Kazakhstan, like the Eurasian scops owl is in the same area. So real nice mix of stuff that you would see in the Mediterranean and stuff that is just incredibly localized. So we're now going to the kind of the driest parts of trip. This area here, well, you can see Bukhara there, and the green around Bukhara is, pretty artificial. It's from mining groundwater and taking water from the rivers, which still flow, but in hugely reduced volume. And perhaps they don't even reach there now, but go to the Aral Sea. I think probably people may have heard of what happened to the Aral Sea, and you may have seen the pictures of those fishing boats in the desert. So it was hugely reduced volume of water there now. I don't know what's there now actually, but quite a lot of the rivers in this part of the world have been used for cotton growing, for the city, etc. So, but really the natural habitat is the desert. It's the Kaiselkum Desert, which means red sand. And apart from these sort of pockets of forest and vegetation which are around habitation, and a few areas along the river, it's a very open, almost desolate habitat. This is what it looks like. Just sand dunes, very soft sand with, on the right is a saxol bush, which is like a real indicator of desert. This area gets maybe 4 or 5 inches of rain a year. So it's not the driest of deserts, but it is very dry. The Saxel plant actually stores water, so the leaves are this scaly green you can see on it. And apparently, people, for the bit if the is it big enough, you can get the bark and squeeze it to get water and drink water from it. And I guess that's what people used to do maybe on when they were working their way along the Silk Road caravans and needed water and weren't at an oasis. But that's what the vegetation looks like. The reason for going to this part of the world is a very localized type of corvid, a type of crow. The Turkestan ground jay or Panda's ground jay, there's 4 species of ground jay, and they do spend most of their time on the ground. This bird's about the size of a blue jay, a shorter tail, maybe slightly larger body. They spend most of the time running around. They live in, like all corvids, they live in family groups. They're probably quite intelligent. Um, they will go and sit on the top of one of these saxel bushes and call. And then they go scurrying off, and they're extremely hard to follow once they start running through the sand. I mentioned there are 4 species. There's one that's basically restricted to Iran, and then there's one in Mongolia, and then there's one in what's called the Tibetan ground jay. So I guess it lives in Tibet, but actually thought it was Xinjiang. But anyway, but a really fascinating, wonderful bird to see. We spent an awful lot of time with this. We had a morning in the desert, and there's only 3 species, and I'll show you. You see basically in the desert. I'll show you a picture of one of the other ones. So there's this. And the other bird you see a lot of is the crested lark, which for anyone who's been to Western Europe, you see all over, well, you don't see all over the place, but it's pretty widespread, but incredibly adaptable bird to live in that habitat. But these birds, you see them in typically groups of 4 or 5. The breeding season must have happened, I guess it's winter, I don't know. Birds, juveniles with them. And, like all corvids, they keep in touch by calling as well. So absolutely wonderful bird. Possibly related, most closely related to nutcrackers, I read, but I don't know whether that's true or not. So I mentioned 2 species already. That's the 3rd species that you get there. When we spent hours and we only spot 3 species. So that's the scrub warbler. Sometimes it's split between the birds that live in Asia, which this one does, and the ones that live in Africa. This used to be a bird that everyone would try and see because it used to be in its own family. I think I mentioned that for the ibis bill, but they decided to lump it with the warbler that is very widespread. So I guess people invested a lot of time seeing, and unfortunately that didn't pay off. But again, it lives in small family groups, hops. It's a pretty small bird. I'm trying to think what a good comparison is. It's about the size of, one of the warblers you see here. It's a different shape, but it's a small bird, very vocal bird. You find them in groups of 3, 4, 5. Not easy to get close to either. As you can tell, I really had to blow this photo up. So what do you go through the area along the roads just because they're, people need things like petrol stations and things. It's a long area. There's places with vegetation, there's houses, and those are very good both for some of the birds which perhaps aren't like really true desert specialists. Although this one is called desert finch, so you'd think it would be, but and it's about the size, it's a bit bigger than a house finch, a really attractive little bird. And in these same areas, you can see a bit of greenery behind it because there's some trees. But certainly when we were there, and maybe a bit before that, in the middle of May, late May, anywhere along the road with trees, you would find migrants. They were all migrant traps because migration was going on at that time. And that's also true of just walking around Bukhara. I showed you some pictures of Bukhara earlier. Around the main square there, you'd be walking around and there'd be, Bligh's reed warblers in every other tree singing away. But anyway, this is one of the birds that kind of likes dry areas, but also likes to be near water as well, and gets as far west as Western Asia. And we, saw a few of these birds. They're really nice, gorgeous birds when they fly because the pink in the wings is much more evident. So I've only really got a couple of birds left now. So I've shown you lots of stuff, and you're probably looking, thinking that looks like a house sparrow, and it is. I'm not trying to trick you. So and then the question is why am I showing you a house sparrow? Well, I'll tell you that in a second. But just to step back from about another, those of you who've been to East Asia would have seen there is an urban sparrow there. It's the Eurasian tree sparrow. So sparrow is the urban sparrow. It's kind of a bit random. Uzbekistan, and the Eurasian tree sparrow is actually the default urban sparrow. This house sparrow is generally is regarded as possibly closer. It's actually a migratory bird. It's house sparrow. It's the Bactriana subspecies of house sparrow. And it's kind of related to some of the other Indian varieties of house sparrow, but they summer in that part of the world, in Uzbekistan, parts of Kazakhstan, and um, they compete people out of the area in winter, and they don't live particularly near habitation. I mean, they might live near a farm, but they're not urban birds at all. And so some people think that this is a bit like the original house sparrow before most of them adapted and thought, well, it's a great idea to live next to people. One other thing to mention that if you think it looks a bit different to our house sparrows, it does. It's a lot more colorful. And it actually has white cheeks. So if you see, stuff bird and you see, this has only happened in the last year, and you see house sparrow, gray cheeked. That's because most of the birds in Western Europe look much. The birds that are in India species is very bright cheeked and a really bright, fun bird to see. But it's nice seeing something different about house sparrows, a bird you think, gee, I know everything, and they surprise you. So, and this is my last bird. So this is another bird. We used to have a wide distribution and is now disappeared from most of its range. This is a marble duck, sometimes known as a marble teal, but I don't think it's particularly. But it occurs in parts of West Asia up to Central Asia on these seasonal water bodies in summer. And we saw a couple of them there. A really nice, gorgeous bird. The males and females look exactly the same. But unfortunately, a bird that just is continually under pressure, which is a little bit of a theme for a lot of the birds here. It was an abbreviated tour to that part of the world, which is enormous months there, and an abbreviated version of my tour with just some of the main photos I got, just to give you an idea of what's there. We're all one full habitat, a fabulous part of the world. Some of these places like Bukhara and Samarkand, which I didn't get to be honest, they're very much worth visiting cities. Great food. So it was a really great trip.